may think the Sega Genesis has nothing left to show you, but unless you've got a complete collection of Genesis games in your basement, or you really have quite the weird relationship with Jimmy from Wikipedia, from one Jimmy to another, please stop trying to guilt me out of my money, the odds are high that there's a title you haven't heard of on Sega's Wonder Console. I'm Jimmy for Cultured Vultures, and let us today look at some unique Sega releases for their most famous console that have mostly fallen through the cracks over the years. A wildly entertaining, unique vertical scrolling shooter, the 1988 Japanese arcade release Phelios was just one of the many amazing games developed for the Namco System 2 arcade system board. A 1990 Genesis port showcases not only an addictive, visually striking game, but also a console that was really starting to come into its own at the start of a new decade. Phelios Kontos draws from Greek mythology for its setting and graphics, with players taking the role of Apollo in pursuit of his beloved Artemis, who's been seized by a demon known as Typhon. The game breaks down into 7 chapters, with tough boss fights waiting at the end of each. It's not the longest game in the world, but it doesn't have to be. Where the game offers something special is in its graphics, which are extremely good for an early-ish Genesis title. The stage designs also do an excellent job of immersing you in a pretty relentless, but not overwhelmingly so, world of bastard skeletons, dragons, and bosses that take classic Greek characters like Medusa to interesting extremes. Phelios will offer a stiff challenge if you're not used to shmups, but there's not much from this period of the Genesis as bright and graphically ambitious, with most vertical shooters opting for spaceships or cute-em-ups. Phelios went its own way. Reminding you that not all mad scientists are evil, some of them are just quite miffed. Decap Attack, coming from the crazy varied folks at Vic Tokai, offers a unique platformer experience in the form of Chuck D. Head, a mummy-esque monster who can only attack enemies by jumping on them or by using the head that protrudes from his bandage-covered chest. So yeah, the mechanics are pretty standard for a platformer, but there's definitely some originality in Chuck's powers and how that influences a surprisingly challenging 1991 platformer game for the Genesis. You can even hit the jump button repeatedly while jumping to slow down your descent, which isn't blowing anyone's minds these days of course, but it is a bit wild for the time. The level designs are certainly pretty eye-catching too, but it's the designs for the various monsters and other creatures Chuck encounters that will make the most impression on you. Decap Attack highlights the Genesis' power with relatively smooth animation and a wide array of graphically striking sprites. Giant mutant frogs, robot tanks, bastard skeleton fish, ghosts, and even the abominable snowman all serve to create a pretty quirky, fun game that reminds you, in the best way possible, of the throwback horror game classics of this era. So yeah, if you like Splatterhouse, you might get a kick out of this goofy cousin of it. If you like Zelda and Dr. Dolittle, you'll probably like this next game too. Crusader of Senti, also known as Soleil in the land of Chippy Chips and Saddy Sadness, deserves to be appreciated on its own merits. However, it's also true that if you've ever really wanted to play The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past on the Sega Genesis, this ridiculously charming action RPG does have that slight but at-home quality to it. Again, Crusader of Senti very much goes on its own path, but it's impossible to look at this game commissioned by Sega to beef up their RPG library and not imagine that the developers at Nextech were going for a certain vibe with this one. Exploring a sprawling, vibrant world with lush 16-bit graphics and memorable characters and monsters, Crusader of Senti pits players as a young man named Corona. You soon discover that you can only communicate with animals, who become a part of your quest that you can actually equip and swap out as needed. Yes, it is like that anime and card game. Yes, Digimon. A total of 16 animals are available, and with the ability to equip 2 at a time, you can dual-wield animals basically. There's plenty of strategy to consider as you move across a great story told in a top-down landscape filled with beautiful scenery, a little bopper of a soundtrack, and roughly 5 million things that want to destroy you. This game physically also wants to destroy your credit score, so yeah, the game does have an emu kind of bird who are, as birds go, known to be quite late. Food for thought, yes? Yeah. A 1995 top-down action game like The Ooze could really only have been developed and published by Sega, especially considering the pretty brilliant and syrupy aesthetic. Slimes, goos, plasms, you name it, Nickelodeon kids were all about it, and everything about this bonkers hidden gem is built around appealing to that same demographic. It's interesting to wonder how a game as bizarre as The Ooze even made it to the Genesis in 1995 when the 5th generation was already heating up. But all that doesn't really matter when it comes to exploring this game's vast world, solving some very tricky, a bit too obtuse puzzles at times to be honest, and fighting a range of monsters using a host of unique abilities, all of which involve using your ooze as either a projectile or a blunt instrument of justice against an evil corporation, as if there's any other form of corporation. The ooze, which Vince McMahon probably would have made into a gimmick in the 90s somehow, if he wasn't so busy being a sexual pervert, benefits a lot from being a product of in-house developers at a time when they knew the console in and out. The soundtrack is as underrated as it gets for a late-stage Genesis game, and even if the ooze can make you Gandalf every 5 or so minutes, everything about this game deserves a fresh look and some new fans, especially as we think it may have influenced Carrion, another great game you should check out. A bit obscure even to many fans of the classic run-and-gun genre, Skeleton Crew is another absolutely fascinating 1995 Sega Genesis artifact that's still a blast to play 30 years later. You can tell it came out that long ago though, we just don't use arcades like C's like we used to, do we? We've lost something there. Anyway, set in the ever closer year of 2062, which is basically tomorrow, Skeleton Crew pits you and a team of mercenaries against a deranged former mortician using cryogenics to create an army of mutants hell-bent on destroying the city. That might sound a little like the plot of a movie that you would find next to Big Jug Wives 26 in the VHS section, but it's obviously the gameplay and your surroundings that will make playing Skeleton Crew its own kind of fun. Yeah, it may not have a ton of weaponry options or much in the way of interactivity with your environment, but Skeleton Crew nevertheless sends you to 4 distinct planets that each come packed with some of the best art direction for a Genesis game at this point in time, or any point in time really, especially if you're a fan of Warhammer 40k. It's a lot of fun to play, although the unusual perspective for the time when combined with the controls can sometimes make for a bit of a frustrating experience, but there's more than enough in the way of attention-grabbing presentation to keep you playing to the end. The music and sound effects in general also sound like Trent Reznor hooked his brain up to a keyboard in the shape of the Necronomicon. Give it a blast. Alright, yeah, so people have been talking about this game on YouTube for a while now, but I did just straight up forget to include it on the Sega Genesis Games That Aged Beautifully video, so consider this my penance. Bizarre is a good way to categorise many of the hidden gems for the Genesis, and Dynamite Headdy is no different in that regard. You're a puppet named Headdy in this weird platformer that came out near the end of the Genesis glory days in 1994, and it falls to you to save your world from a vicious puppet king in a fast-paced, utterly gorgeous game from the same people who brought you Gunstar Heroes. And if you know Gunstar Heroes and its penchant for relentless action combined with great tension and beautiful peak 16-bit graphics, then you have a rough idea of the fun you're in for with Dynamite Headdy. Using detachable appendages to aid you in your quest, Dynamite Headdy doesn't have the normal power-ups you might be expecting. Instead, you'll be swapping out your head for different ones with different sorts of abilities as the game goes on. It's a clever twist on an old part of the formula, and it creates a challenging platformer with side-scrolling shooter levels thrown in for the hell of it that really doesn't have anything you can reasonably compare it to, though fans of Rayman and Never Dead might get a kick out of this. The Never Dead Hive is truly never dead. In the far-off future of 2016, war for mineral rights in Africa with tanks known as maneuver scepters sets the stage for the forgotten gem Granada. Released in 1990, this shooter still looks and plays quite well for a game well over 30 years old. Granada on paper may sound pretty standard for its genre, and while it's true that the controls and basic demands of the game are nothing particularly new, it's once again the representation of things that makes this game more than just an entertaining, forgotten release for the Sega Genesis. The game especially goes in its own direction with regards to how you can explore and interact with your environment. Granada doesn't have the forced scrolling that would become standard for these sorts of games, leaving you to instead complete the maze-like levels with a certain degree of freedom. It's a certain degree of freedom because the game does come with a timer, meaning you have to meet the objectives and defeat a challenge within a certain span of time. It's like Dead Rising with sadly a lot less drop-kicking and pies in faces. It's a nice element to the overall challenge if you hate yourself a little bit, and so don't be afraid to crank that difficulty setting down just a tiny tad, especially if you're like me and staring at a clock is a terrifying reminder that you only have so many seconds left and will never get any of them back. Next game. A 16-bit remake of a title called Linus Spacehead's Cosmic Crusade released the year prior for the Nintendo Entertainment System, and you thought The Last of Us Part 2 was too soon. The 1993 game Cosmic Spacehead is another one that we wish had way more fans. Developed by the UK company Codemasters, who are now mastering how to ruin their games, there aren't a whole lot of titles out there, let alone for the Genesis, that combine the point-and-click adventure game with light platforming elements. Yet that's exactly what you're going to do as the titular Cosmic Spacehead. As a series of episodic adventures, Cosmic Spacehead does a nice job of taking you around the world to find proof of your previous adventures to your people from the planet Linoleum. It's a tough, kinda clunky and a bit weird game at certain points, but that's offset by one of the most graphically underappreciated games in the entire Genesis library, with an emphasis on puzzle solving that's easy to break down more often than not. Cosmic Spacehead has ample visual charm and a sheer novelty factor that should be experienced at least once. Chances are good, however, that you'll get seriously hooked on this little oddball and might gain a new favourite hidden gem. "1991 was a very good year for Sega and the Genesis, so it's fair enough that some games would simply fall through the cracks. Gain Ground is one such example, featuring action mechanics with a heavier emphasis on strategy than you might expect. Your objective is to either get your soldiers to the other side of the battlefield or to wipe out absolutely everyone on the opposing side, with combat spread out across different time periods and worlds. Pretty neat, yeah? Well, everything about Gain Ground feels kind of new, which is a weird thing to say about a game that originally debuted in arcades more than 4 decades ago. Once you get over the minor learning curve this title throws at you, what you have is an action game with a real-time strategy component that keeps you in constant movement, questioning everything and trying to destroy everyone in front of you. Starting out with 3 soldiers for normal mode, you'll be able to recruit up to 20 soldiers for your cause, each with their own strengths, weaknesses, and abilities. Gain Ground is a deeper game than you'd think at first glance, and it's the sort of whipper you can accidentally sink a dozen or so hours into, and then drag a friend along to play some co-op with you for another dozen. Long before the series became a staple of Toonami and Adult Swim,
"Get ready, everybody. He's about to do something stupid."
Yu Yu Hakusho Makio Toyotsusen, please forgive me Chris Affable from abroad in Japan, was a Japan-exclusive brawler for the Genesis, though it did interestingly come to Brazil all the way in 1999, and it showed the successful manga and anime series in a fantastic fighting game light. While the graphics may immediately grab you as being something that wouldn't look out of place in the following generation on the Saturn, it's when you pick up the controller and start to play that you experience the ways in which Yu Yu Hakusho is more than just another arcade-style fighter from the 16-bit era. In particular, it's the fact that the game offers 1-on-1 or 2-on-2 fighting options, with the 2-on-2 option specifically supporting 4 players. This was highly unusual for a 1994 fighting game, as is the sheer amount of voice acting crunched into the cartridge. Novelty aside, the game controls beautifully with fluid movement and 11 characters, which makes it all the more of a shame that yet another treasure banger never got a European or North American release. You'll likely have to turn to emulation to check out Yu Yu Hakusho Makio Toyatsusen for yourself, but it's worth the effort for this forgotten gem, and I hope it was worth the effort for me to learn how to pronounce that terribly, might I add. Might I also add, outro gang, that we made it and we are now here in the outro. I can't stay long, it's bonfire night where I am and there's currently a bunch of panicked Welsh children outside acting like the dragons have come home. I've been Jimmy for Cultured Vultures. It's been good to have you, and thank you for watching.